Hello and welcome to The Address. I'm your host, Brandon Darby. This past Wednesday, January 20th, saw the transition of administrations between the Trump and Biden presidencies. Along with President Biden being sworn in, Kamala Harris was sworn in as Vice President of the United States. Vice President Harris is the first woman and the first person of color to be elected to her position. In the United States' 245-year history, for the first time, we have a female vice president. The road to this milestone for women in politics is not one that was traveled overnight, but instead was walked and often marched along over the course of the last 2 centuries. I believe it worth addressing the long, hard-fought road to this milestone and honoring those women who worked for progress and equality and representation. In the early decades of the United States, the requirements for who could vote was highly restrictive. The right to vote was not even guaranteed to all white men, as citizens were originally required to own a certain amount of property and wealth in order to be eligible to vote. This focus on property and wealth meant that some women were even able to vote in the early decades of our republic. For example, New Jersey laws enacted in 1790 and 1797 actually referred to voters as he or she. However, over time, these wealth restrictions on voting were repealed, and in their stead, restrictions were put in place based on gender and race. Going back to New Jersey, in 1807, a law was passed that stripped women of the right to vote, a right that they would not get back for over a century. In the decades before the Civil War, it was women and people of color who did not have the right to vote. However, while we associate the women's movement with the early 20th century, there were people back in the early 19th century fighting for women's rights and laying the groundwork for future movements. In 1848, in Seneca Falls, New York, the first Women's Rights Convention was brought together by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott and others. Those in attendance at this convention were mostly women's rights activists, but some among them were also abolitionists, fighting for the end of slavery. At the Seneca Falls Convention, the attendees worked on what would be called the Declaration of Sentiments. This declaration was modeled after that of the Declaration of Independence, where the Declaration of Independence cited the issues that the colonists had against the Crown of England. The Declaration of Sentiments addressed the issues women had with their lives being dominated and decided by men. This declaration from the Women's Convention even invoked the Declaration of Independence, declaring that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. White women were not the only ones fighting for women's suffrage in the United States. Sojourner Truth was born a slave in New York in 1797. She was bought and sold several times over the course of her early life before running away in 1827, and with the help of an abolitionist family, the Van Wageners, she bought her freedom. She would go on to become a religious speaker, abolitionist, and women's rights activist. Truth's most well-known work championing women's rights was her Ain't I a Woman speech, a speech in which she railed not just against her being discriminated against because she was a woman, but that she was also rarely even given the small dignities that women were given in her time, but because of the color of her skin. Later in her career, Truth would at times be in opposition against other abolitionists, such as Frederick Douglass, who believed that freed black men should receive the right to vote before women did. For Truth, there was no reason why women and black men shouldn't be able to receive that right at the same time. The growing division of the United States over the issue of slavery in the decade before the Civil War would see progress on women's rights come to a halt as more effort was focused on the abolition movement. Following the end of the Civil War, however, women saw a new chance to secure the right to vote. The end of the Civil War saw the addition of 3 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. The 13th outlawed slavery. The 14th reinforced who was a citizen of the United States, and that the states could not pass laws infringing those citizens' rights given to them by the federal government. And the 15th said that the right to vote could not be infringed upon based on one's race or previous condition of servitude. It was the 14th and 15th Amendments where women saw the opportunity to secure their right to vote. Suffragists such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony opposed the two amendments because they did not include women among those who were eligible to vote. The 14th Amendment, as it is written, specifically says that male citizens over the age of 21 are who should be able to vote. Suffragists worked to have women included in the amendments, but eventually they were ratified without giving women the right to vote. Despite this setback, the women's rights movement continued, and over the next half-century, women would begin to run for and be elected to various positions in government, even without having the right to vote themselves. In 1872, Victoria Woodhull would become the first woman to run for President of the United States. She ran on the ticket of the Equal Rights Party, who had also selected Frederick Douglass for vice president. The candidacy, however, was not taken seriously, and she received no electoral votes. In 1887, Susanna Salter would become the first female mayor in the country, in Argonia, Kansas. Salter's election was a surprise even to herself because she had not run for the office. Her name had been placed on the ballot as a prank by men in the town, hoping to humiliate and discourage women from politics. However, being the small town that Argonia was, voters knew who Salter was, and after she publicly committed to serving as mayor, should she be elected, several political groups in the town, including the local Republican Party, dropped their preferred candidates and backed her. A reporter from the New York Sun attended a council meeting after Mayor Salter's election and wrote about how she showed to be a good parliamentarian, keeping irrelevant discussion to a minimum and making sure others followed procedure. Almost a decade later, in 1896, Martha Hughes Cannon would be the first elected female state senator, serving in the Utah State Senate. Among others who ran against her, one of them was her own husband, who she received 2,000 more votes than. 2 decades later, Jeannette Rankin, a Republican from Montana, would become the first woman elected to Congress. She would serve 2 different terms, 1917 to 1919 and 1941 to 1942. She served during the United States entry into both world wars and each time was the only lawmaker in Congress to vote against involvement in the wars, as she was a devout pacifist. Just a few years after Rankin was first elected to Congress, the 19th Amendment would be passed in 1920, granting women the right to vote. In 1932, Hattie Wyatt Caraway, an Arkansas Democrat, would become the first woman elected to the U.S. Senate. Originally, she had been appointed to fulfill the remainder of her deceased husband's position as senator, and there was an expectation that come time for the special election, she would step aside. However, she surprised politicians hopeful for her seat when she announced that she would run for her own full term. Her winning against expectations set precedent for future women in politics. In 1968, Shirley Chisholm became the first Black woman elected to serve in Congress, representing the 12th District of New York. Congresswoman Chisholm was not the first woman of a major party to seek that party's nomination for presidency, but she was the first one to actively campaign for it when she ran in the Democratic primaries in 1972. She won the New Jersey primary, and at the Democratic National Convention for that year, she would manage to garner 151 delegates. Just over a decade after Chisholm's campaign for the Democratic nomination, in 1984, Congresswoman Geraldine Ferraro would become the first woman to run on a major party's national ticket. Ferraro was selected by Walter Mondale as his running mate for the presidency on the Democratic Party's ticket. Unfortunately for Ferraro's hopes of being the first female vice president, she and Walter Mondale were running against incumbent President Ronald Reagan. Reagan was extremely popular at the time of his re-election, winning the popular vote by a 16-point margin and winning 49 of the 50 states in the Electoral College. Ferraro is regarded as having had neither a positive or negative impact on the Democratic ticket, with their unsuccessful campaign failing mainly because of Reagan's popularity. It would be 3 decades before another woman got a chance at the vice presidency. The second woman to be nominated to a party's national ticket was Sarah Palin, when John McCain selected her as his running mate for the Republican Party in the 2008 election. At the time, Palin was serving as the governor of Alaska, the first woman to hold that office when she was elected in 2006. The McCain-Palin ticket would win 22 states, receiving 173 electoral votes to the 365 votes received by Democrats' Obama-Biden ticket. The same year that Sarah Palin was the Republican nominee for vice president, Hillary Clinton ran in the Democratic presidential primary. She ultimately lost to Barack Obama. However, she would again run for the Democratic nomination 8 years later in 2016. This time, she was successful in securing the Democratic nomination and became the first woman to head a major party's ticket. Clinton was the first lady when her husband Bill Clinton served as president, was elected as the first woman senator from New York after her husband's presidency, and for a couple of years during the Obama-Biden administration, served as Secretary of State. Clinton would run against Republican nominee Donald Trump in a contentious election. Ultimately, Clinton received 3 million more votes than Trump, but failed to win the presidency, due to the Electoral College where she won 227 votes to Trump's 304. Now, we are caught up to the present. This past year saw incumbent President Donald Trump and Vice President Mike Pence run against Democratic nominees Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Prior to her selection as Biden's running mate, Harris served as Attorney General of California and Senator from California. Harris was the third female vice presidential nominee on a major ticket, and now she is the first female vice president of the United States, after she and Biden won 306 electoral votes to the Republicans' 232, and 7 million more votes in the popular count. The question now for the future is, when will a woman be elected to the presidency? And who will that be? President Biden previously has said that he would serve only one term, although there has been no commitment made to that. Should President Biden not decide to seek re-election in 2024, that would open the path for Kamala Harris to be the front-runner for her party's nomination. Vice President Harris has previously campaigned for the Democratic nomination, and now with her position as the second most powerful Democrat in her party, she would be well positioned to receive the nomination for president in 2024. Now, this is in no way an exhaustive history of women's political rights and representation. We didn't cover the multiple women's organizations involved in earning the right to vote in the early 1900s, the many black women leaders in the civil rights movement of the 1960s, or more modern women leaders such as Nancy Pelosi, the first female Speaker of the House, or Stacey Abrams, who was a leader in registering disenfranchised citizens in Georgia. This is just a brief history of women's rights to put into context the historic and important achievement of Kamala Harris as the first female vice president of the United States, an achievement breaking a long-standing glass ceiling and empowering women and young girls across the country.